Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Sweet Nightmares, the Dream World Chronicles Book 1 by Chynna Pace, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. It was an ordinary December day in Raleigh, except it wasn't ordinary at all, because an ordinary day wouldn't entail my dead mother lying in a coffin, and me staring down at her, but there she rested, and here I stood. And all around me hung the scent of loss. Everywhere. It breathed through the trees and rustled the leaves on the ground and clung to people's cheeks in the form of tears. Everyone seemed overtaken with it with the loss. Everyone except me. Why did it feel like I had lost nothing at all, but only been reminded of the thing that was never mine? Yes, that stiff, smooth-skinned, cold-bodied thing in the cushioned box was my mother. Yes, the car accident that took her from this world had come as a great shock, and yes, the result of it was weighing on me, but not the way it seemed to weigh on the rest of the procession. I looked around and noticed how cold it was. It wasn't just a cold you felt. The chill in the air was so very visible. Icy winds swept over the cemetery, reddening cheeks, tousling hair. People shivered as they approached me, their teeth chattered around their words of condolences. A funeral in winter. It just didn't seem right, and I wasn't even grieving. Right. That was the problem with me. All of this should have been sad, depressing even. I should have been spiraling into a black hole of sorrow, because that was what happened when people lost their mothers. But she'd never been mine to lose. So when an array of people came forward and gave their 2 cents on how great and amazing of a person she was, my mind blanked. I felt distant, like I was hearing a speech on some long-dead historical figure. And none of the people were familiar either. Who were they all? Some of them I recognized from the rare times I'd gone to Mom's workplace to earn her attention. There was Danielle, the front desk lady, and a few of the girls from Mom's competition team, except it was hard to recognize them without their skin-tight leotards and the severe hair buns that looked like they would cut off all the circulation on their heads. They all seemed to know my mom more than I ever had. It was that one prickly little thought that did a better job of sending tears to my eyes than my mother's corpse ever could. "Alex, I'm gonna miss you so much!" A tearful woman threw herself at me. Mrs. Fuller, my English teacher. She was 30 and pretty and had been the first person to rise to the occasion when tragedy struck. All the half-eaten casseroles and cakes at home, those were from her. She'd even spent nights at our house so my sister and I wouldn't be alone. She wasn't just a teacher, she was a friend. "I'll miss you too," I murmured into her strawberry-scented hair, the one thing in the cemetery not reeking of loss. My voice didn't sound like my own. It was hard and grating, like the mechanical whine of a broken robot. She pulled away slightly, just enough for me to get a good look at her moist red face. Holding me at arm's length, she said, "I hope your grandmother's a good person. I hope she's nice to you. I wanted to take you in myself, but my husband wasn't fond of the idea. He's never loved children as much as I do." A guilty look filled her shimmering eyes. "That's okay, Mrs. Fuller." As I said it, the image of the email I received earlier that week swam to memory. The social worker's brisk letter had delivered both good and bad news. The good was that Zoe and I weren't going to a foster home. I'd been fully convinced that we'd have to, but the woman in charge of our case revealed that there was actually someone in our family we could go to. Matilda Racas, our grandmother in New Britain, Connecticut. The bad? Well, we'd never met the woman. Ever. She was our grandmother, but she might as well have been a stranger. Mom was an only child, and both her parents had died ages ago, so the unknown grandmother was from our father's side. My blood warmed a bit at that thought. Would she know anything about Dad's disappearance? The idea gave me conflicting feelings. More than anything, I wanted to know the truth about our father. I'd never believed Mom's feeble explanation that he'd gone far, far away on an amazing adventure. That story was about 10 years too old anyway. Yet what if I didn't want to know the truth either? What if it was bad? Part of me was eager to move in with this strange woman to unearth secrets and have a second chance at a real family. The other part of me was afraid of what it might bring up. But what other option did we have? I couldn't decline. I couldn't just say, nope, you know what? I don't like the sound of this grandma person, so we're just going to be orphans instead. No, I couldn't do that to Zoe. I had to protect her. Where was Zoe anyway? Don't hesitate to call or text whenever you need to, Mrs. Fuller said. I hope you'll stay in touch. My eyes roamed the cemetery, searching the grounds for my missing sister. Absent-mindedly, I told my teacher, Don't worry, I will. A familiar shape clothed in black and facing a bush a little ways away caught my eye. I sighed and looked at Mrs. Fuller. I better go check on Zoe. Thankfully, she didn't try to hold me back. Dead grass crunched beneath my feet as I trudged away from the throng. I weaved my way through the graves, sidestepping living bodies and corpses alike. Up ahead, standing beneath a gray, overcast sky, was my little sister, small and dark and fairy-like. Her brown curls waved in the wind, moving in sync with the fluttering hem of her dress. From behind her, I watched as she reached out and plunged her arm into the depths of the shrub. Alarm coursed through me. I moved faster, calling out her name. She craned her head over her shoulder and watched me approach with those huge eyes of hers. Even from several yards away, I could see them bulging out of her skull. I used to tease her about her resemblance to Dobby from the Harry Potter movies. Zoe didn't laugh much, but that had always made her crack a tiny smile. I studied her eyes carefully as I stopped in front of her, wondering if I would find any moisture swimming around in her brown gaze. But her eyes were dry, and her face was as expressionless as ever. Zoe, what are you doing? You'll hurt yourself. It was a strange sight, the evergreen shrub, its leaves bright and green and thriving in a place where everything was dead. And my sister standing there, all her bones and angles prominent underneath her black dress, her face drier than burnt toast, her arms shoved deep into the bush. She'd taken off her coat, too, leaving her arms bare and exposed and chill-laden. In answer, she held out a crumpled piece of paper. On it was a colored pencil sketch of a spider with a pointy green body and yellow legs. Hasty drawing through it was beautiful and realistic. Impressive, like all of Zoe's artwork. I visited this spider in my dreams last night, she said. It looks exactly like one I just saw in this bush. I'm trying to catch it. I sighed. There went Zoe and her big imagination again. I suppose it was natural, considering her age and affinity for art, but still, it always unsettled me how vividly she talked about her dreams. Ever since she was little, she described the events and scenes she sees at night as though they were real, not just figments of fantasy. I noticed all the sharp, prickly barbs covering the plant, and my heart screamed in horror. But Zoe, the thorns! Doesn't that hurt? Ignoring me, she bent toward the bush and peered between its vibrant leaves. She stared and stared and stared as if searching for her long-lost love. Finally, after a lengthy moment, she straightened up. It ran away. You scared it. Though impassivity drenched her tone, she was clearly upset. I felt obligated to apologize, but the thought of saying sorry for scaring away a spider seemed ridiculous enough to make me laugh. And I didn't want to laugh or cry or do anything in this place. Zoe pulled out her arm, and I gasped. Her skin was flecked with cuts and scratches from the thorns. Many of them were bleeding. I sighed and forced myself to be the calm older sister she needed. Now, we can't have you bleeding all over the graves, can we? I smiled warmly at her. Come on, let's go get you cleaned up before you stir up someone's ghost. A short concrete building sat at the edge of the cemetery. It housed the bathrooms. I strode toward it, Zoe trotting beside me in silence. I wondered what was going through her head. There was no telling if she was thinking about green spiders or our mother. I was kind of glad I didn't know. To my intense relief, the bathroom was empty and warm. Zoe leaned against the sinks as I bustled around. I was glad to have something to do other than standing around freezing to death and watching men I've never met bury the mother I never knew. I yanked out a wad of paper towels from a wall dispenser, then dampened them under a stream of warm water. After wringing out the wad, I turned to my sister. We stared at each other for a string of quiet seconds. The fluorescent lights washed out her skin. Her complexion has always been paler than mine, but right then she looked positively ghostly. It won't hurt, I said gently. Yes, it will, she said, stretching her right arm toward me. The corners of my mouth lifted. Okay, it might sting a little, but no more than it did when you stuck your arm in the bush in the first place. Holding the moist towels in one hand and Zoe's arm in the other, I let my eyes leave hers and trained my gaze downward. A gasp escaped me. Zoe's arm was perfect. Her skin was the light caramel-tinged shade of cream it always was. Aside from the occasional black mole, there were no imperfections. Not a scratch, not a blood droplet in sight. The marks of the thorny bush were gone. Slowly, I raised my gaze. Our eyes met a second time. "Zoe," I said, "are you sure it was this arm, not your left one?" "I'm sure." Just to be certain, I dropped her right arm and picked up her left one. I turned it over in my fingers, inspecting every inch of her skin, and yet nothing. There was nothing wrong with her arms. Neither of them. Something slithery crept over the back of my neck. I made myself chuckle for Zoe's sake. "Wow, Zoe, I've never seen anyone heal that fast before." My little sister looked down at her arm, then up at me. Where did my cuts go? I had blood and everything. There aren't even any scabs. Alex, what did you do with my cuts?" I laughed shakily. It almost sounded hysterical. "I'm sorry, Zoe. It's about time you found out. I'm not really your sister. I'm an injury stealer in disguise." Zoe didn't laugh. She didn't even smile. My stomach did a weird flip and landed somewhere in my toes. Just then the metal door rang with a sharp rap, and a tentative voice sounded outside. "Alex, Zoe, are you girls in there?" It was Mrs. Fuller. "The funeral's over, and your grandmother's here." A shiver went through me. I'd been expecting it, but now that the time had actually come, a strange combination of dread and anticipation overwhelmed me. "Thanks, Mrs. Fuller. We'll be right out." I tossed the unused paper towel lump into the trash, then picked up Zoe's hand. Her fingers hinted at the emotions she felt but refused to talk about. They trembled, and her palm was sticky with sweat. "I don't want to go, Alex," she said. "Why can't we just keep living in our house, just me and you?" My heart ached for both of us. "I wish we could, Zoe, but the people in charge say we need a guardian, so to grandmother's house we go." Zoe turned away from me toward the door. She hid her face, pulled her hand free. Then frosty air surged into the bathroom as my little sister opened the door. I followed after her in anxiety. I was no longer mulling over the strange disappearance of her wounds. Now, all I could think about was the drastic way things were about to change and whether or not Zoe and I would be able to handle it. Led by my English teacher, we trailed behind the stream of people leaving the gravesite. As we walked, I reflected on who I was on my way to see, and my thoughts spurred a series of dark questions in my mind. Why did this woman who claims to be our grandmother wait until the service was over to pick us up? Her daughter-in-law died. Why did she refuse to be present for the burial? And why had she stayed out of our lives all this time? Connecticut was a long way away, but was that really an excuse? I tried to imagine what the woman might look like. Something like her son, I expected. But if I was honest with myself, I couldn't remember him either. I'd been 4 when he walked out on us. My only memory of my father wasn't really a memory, but an aura, an image of someone gold. A gold man with gold hair and gold eyes, and a wide smile that radiated like jewels. Zoe wouldn't have any memory of him, of course. He'd left a week after she was born. I stared at her as we walked and wished she would tell me how she was feeling, because then I could tell her how I was feeling, and we might be able to hug and talk and get through this together. But my sister had been closed off for a while, even before all this happened. I couldn't expect her to behave any differently. The cemetery gates loomed ahead, tall and made of wrought iron. Beyond them lied East Street, all the cars parked at its curb. The vehicle at the front of the line stood diagonally on the edge of the street, blocking the entire entranceway as if the driver had parked in a hurry on top of being unskilled. It was a big, bulky vehicle, black and depressing looking. It was a hearse. My first thought was of the vehicle that had transported my mother's body, but that hearse had been white, and it was still back at the gravesite. I couldn't imagine why there would be 2 hearses here. Was another funeral happening today? Mrs. Fuller paused in front of the black vehicle. I looked at her in confusion. Why did she stop walking? Before I had time to ask, the driver's side door of the hearse flew open and a woman stepped out into the street. The first few details my brain registered were these. Silvery hair pulled back into a painfully tight bun just like the ones Mom's students boasted. A sheer purple shawl covering angular shoulders, strings of flashy multicolored beads hanging from a wrinkly ivory-skinned neck, and eyes as round and gold as butterscotch candies. Those eyes unsettled me. They were like the eyes of a feral cat or a wild beast or some awful half-human creature I'd read about in a novel. I dropped my gaze, focusing on the woman's fragile form instead. She was frightfully thin, and as I watched her hobble towards us on the sidewalk, it occurred to me that this woman might be the reason for Zoe's scrawniness. Mom had been curvy, and so was I. I'd always wondered where my sister inherited her skeletal figure. Now I understood. Matilda Rocas stood before my sister and I and opened her mouth. Then, without even a hello or a smile or anything, she barked, "Alexandra? Sophia?" I frowned. They were the names on our birth certificates, but, actually we go by Alex and Zoe, I said. My voice hushed. She made her disapproval known with a hoarse grunt. Two perfectly fine names ruined. All right, hurry. We've got a long drive. Her voice was gruff and tinged with a subtle European accent, and as she opened the back seat door, her shawl rustled in the wind, and I caught sight of a strange-looking tattoo on her forearm. A royal blue crescent moon circled by 4 little golden stars. Just as I was wondering about its significance, the old woman yanked her shawl tighter around her and fixed those unnerving yellow eyes on Zoe and I. "Well," she snapped, "what are you waiting for?" My gut lurched. It felt like I was in a bad movie. How had this happened? A week ago, things were normal. My friends Dylan, Jamie, and I lined up outside of Barnes & Noble to be the first people to get the next book in our favorite series the moment it was released. Zoe showed me a new painting she did, a macabre portrait of a girl with black roses for eyes, someone she claimed she visited in a dream. Mom helped me with my biology homework, which just meant she glanced at my textbook for 5 seconds and then ran off to teach a ballet class. I made dinner for Zoe and I, fried rice and brownies. Not a bad combination either. But everything had changed now. In the blink of an eye, I'd lost a sort of mother and gained a sort of grandmother. A grandmother I'd never met who had bizarre eyes and drove a hearse and seemed to think Alex and Zoe were ruined names. I'd hoped for someone warm, someone jovial and doting, someone to wrap Zoe and I in her arms and bake us cookies and be the mother and grandmother we'd never had. But Matilda Rocas seemed to be the exact opposite of that fantasy. She stared at us expectantly, and for a wild moment of insanity, I was tempted to run, to grab Zoe's hand and bolt. Had Mrs. Fuller not been there to give the small of my back the encouraging little prod it needed, I might have actually gone through with it. But my feet stumbled forward, and all at once it sunk in. I realized the harsh reality of what was about to happen. My sister and I were going to get into this weird car with this weird woman and ride hundreds of miles to a town I'd never even heard of before. We would come to a house where Zoe and I would be given rooms, and we'd have to unpack and lie on unfamiliar beds. And in the morning we would wake up to find that it hadn't been a nightmare after all, that it had all been real. And there was absolutely nothing I could do about it. The old woman made an impatient noise and climbed back into the driver's seat. I faced my English teacher and gave her one last hug. She kissed my cheek and whispered that things were going to be all right, even though I wasn't so sure they would be. When I whirled back around, Zoe was already in the back seat of the hearse with her seatbelt on. She stared straight ahead at some random spot in space, not looking at me or our grandmother or anything else. I knew that look. It was the look she always got when she came home from a school with the news that yet another kid had been mean to her. The Zoe Rocas signature I'm trying not to cry face. I crawled inside and joined her. The hearse's warm interior enveloped me, and the door shut with an ominous bang, trapping us inside. I stared stony-faced at my lap as the hearse lurched into the street and then zoomed away from the cemetery, wondering if I would ever smile or laugh again, or if this strange emptiness would persist, if I would end up as blank and detached as my poor little sister.